Hi, my friend. Tonight, we are traveling back to a strange, shivering moment in medieval Europe when the world was quiet, not from peace, but from fear. The Black Death had arrived. In its shadow, people turned to prayer. And pigs. You are standing in a dim stone cottage. Outside, the air smells of ash and thyme. Inside, someone lies feverish beneath a wool blanket. And next to them, a pig. Yes, a live pig, snuffling and squealing softly, believed to absorb the sickness like a sponge. Across the village, dogs howl before dawn, and the elders shake their heads. Another soul will depart today. And somewhere in the market square, someone is tying a chicken to their armpit, just in case. You probably wouldn't survive this, but you definitely leave behind an interesting pet story. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me, where are you watching from tonight, and what time is it? Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. When the plague came, the eerie silence before it swept through towns. It often began with a silence, not a gentle, sleepy hush, but the thick, uneasy kind, like the world holding its breath. In some villages, it came on the breeze, an odor that smelled wrong, like wet earth and sour cloth. In others, it was the sudden absence of laughter from the tavern or the echo of carts left unpushed in the market square. Then someone would say it aloud. It's come. The plague. They didn't call it Yersinia pestis, not yet. They didn't know about fleas or rats or bacteria that hitch rides in warm fur and multiply in warm blood. No, what they knew was this: the Black Death had returned. And everything, absolutely everything, was about to change. There are many ways to measure a plague: in the number of graves dug, the churches filled with prayers, or the amount of garlic suddenly missing from every pantry. But here, in this first quiet moment, you could measure it by the way people looked at each other. Suspicion, fear, and something deeper, resignation perhaps. A knowing that something bigger than reason had entered their lives. In medieval towns, people had rules for illness: bad humors, imbalanced bile, maybe your sins, maybe a hot wind from the east. But the plague didn't play by those rules. It arrived like a ghost and acted like a storm. A person could feel fine at breakfast and be cold by sundown. And once it started, it did not move slowly. They tried to hold it off in all the ways they knew: ringing church bells, fasting, dousing themselves in vinegar, putting herbs in their beards, avoiding bad smells because maybe smell was the cause, and flowers pinned to your shirt might keep death out of your lungs. And then there were the animals. At first, the animals were simply present, quiet companions in fields and homes. But as fear deepened and cures failed, people began to see them differently. A dog that barked at night, a sign, a pig that rooted near the sick, a volunteer healer, a cat that sat too long staring at the wall, maybe something darker. In one town, it was said that the pigs were dying after sleeping beside the sick. "They take the sickness for us," people whispered. And suddenly, pigs were invited into bedrooms, not as pets, but as shields. You can imagine the smell, the sound, the confusion of the pig. Elsewhere, dogs were watched with anxious hope. If a dog howled outside a house, it meant someone inside would die before dawn. It became common practice to muzzle them or keep them far from homes altogether. But when a dog did howl, people took it seriously. "It knows," they'd say. The line between science and superstition blurred easily in a time of terror. Even the learned physicians wore bird-like masks stuffed with herbs, thinking the shape would keep away the bad air. They looked like giant beaked owls wandering the streets, poking at corpses with sticks. But for the everyday person, someone tending a small garden or mending a child's torn cloak, healing had always been about what was around you. And animals had always been around. Chickens, goats, oxen. Each took on new meanings. Some were sacrificed, others were feared. A few were blamed. And while the church bells tolled endlessly, people began to whisper, not just about saints, but about the dog who sat on old Marta's doorstep the night before she died. Or the pig that squealed all morning and by evening was gone along with its owner. Fear is a strange thing. It rewrites the rules. It teaches you to watch for signs where none existed before. It makes you believe that a beast with 4 legs might know more about fate than a man with 40 years of scripture in his mind. And so, as the plague crept through alleys and fields, people watched not just the sky or the priests, but the animals. Because sometimes, when no cure worked and no priest had answers, you turned to the pig, the dog, the owl. You watched and you waited. In the end, perhaps they weren't healers or prophets. But in that great silence of medieval terror, they were something. They were there. The healing pig theory. Why people placed pigs near the sick. Let's imagine for a moment that you are very sick. You've begun to cough a deep, earthy rattle that tastes like copper and feels like fire. Your joints ache, your head burns, and a strange swelling has formed in your armpit. You are afraid. Your family is afraid. And then, someone, perhaps your grandmother, says the words that no one wants to hear. We need a pig. Now this isn't about eating. The pig isn't lunch. The pig is medicine. Welcome to the curious medieval belief that pigs could absorb illness, especially during the plague. The idea, while odd to us, was rooted in ancient folk logic. Animals are close to the earth, and pigs in particular are known for rooting in dirt, living low to the ground, and surviving nearly anything. They were seen as sturdy, resilient, and most importantly disposable. And so in some villages, when a person showed signs of plague, a piglet was brought into the room. It might lie at the foot of the bed, squealing now, and then utterly confused. Sometimes the pig was even placed on the patient's chest or stomach, believed to draw out the evil humors or toxins from the human body into its own. This wasn't done out of cruelty. Quite the opposite. It was seen as care. The pig in its sacrifice was a kind of healer, or perhaps a stand-in for the patient's pain. And in many stories, passed down through generations, the pigs did get sick. Some died. And when they did, the people believed the illness had passed from the human into the animal, completing a strange, sacred exchange. In some parts of Europe, these pigs were not eaten afterward. They were buried with quiet reverence, as if they had performed a holy task. In other regions they were eaten, though cautiously, and with many prayers or herbs thought to neutralize any lingering plague. One could argue the prayers were the stronger seasoning. There's a story from rural France recorded in a 17th century folk tale of a man named Julien whose wife fell ill during a minor outbreak. With no doctor nearby, he brought in their family pig, Rosette, and let it lie beside his wife for 3 nights. The pig grew lethargic, then collapsed. The wife recovered. Rosette did not. For years after, Julien refused to eat pork. Not because of sadness, he said, but out of respect for the medicine that once had ears and a curly tail. Today, we know this makes little scientific sense. The plague is spread by bacteria carried by fleas, often living on rats, not pigs. But in the chaos of a medieval epidemic, people were desperate. They turned to what they had, and they had pigs. Pigs were plentiful, easy to raise, and close to human life, both physically and emotionally. Children named them. Farmers talked to them. They were familiar, and that familiarity bred not contempt, but hope. If something so ordinary could become extraordinary, maybe all was not lost. Of course, not everyone believed in pig healing. Some thought it dangerous, fearing that the pigs might carry the disease instead of cure it. Laws were sometimes passed restricting animals in plague houses. But in remote areas, villages tucked between forests and rivers, people often followed older, quieter ways. Ways that hadn't yet been erased by science or shame. And really, what is medicine but a mix of hope and ritual? The healing pig theory is a strange footnote in the long story of human survival. But it reminds us that in moments of fear, even the humble pig, muddy, snorting, awkward, can be a symbol of grace. And maybe, just maybe, lying next to a pig gave someone enough comfort to sleep. And sometimes sleep is the first medicine of all. Dogs who knew too much. Prophetic howls before a death. It begins with a howl. low, drawn out, and trembling at the edge of silence. You're lying awake in your bed of straw. The scent of lavender sachets, tucked beneath your pillow, meant to keep away bad air, but it does little to calm you. Outside in the night, a dog begins to cry. You freeze. Because in medieval Europe, that sound didn't just mean the dog was hungry, or bored, or lonely. It meant someone nearby was about to die. The belief that dogs could sense death was widespread across plague-ridden Europe. These were not just animals to guard sheep or fetch scraps. They were considered omens, living weather vanes that pointed toward the storm of mortality. A dog that howled outside your door was a sign that the sickness had already crossed your threshold, even if you hadn't felt the fever yet. And it wasn't just superstition. People noticed patterns. Again and again they whispered. The dog barked before the coughing began. The dog scratched at the door the night before my uncle passed. There are stories, some chronicled, others passed down orally, of dogs who refused to leave a sick person's side, whimpering days in advance. Others who stood vigil outside doors, then vanished after the final breath. And then there were the dogs who ran in panic when a person began to show symptoms as though trying to escape the inevitable. In England, it was believed that black dogs were especially attuned to death. Not only the spectral ones from folklore like Black Shuck, the ghostly hound of East Anglian legend, but real flesh-and-bone mutts who would sit under windowsills and stare. Stare until someone drew the curtain, or died. And in Italy, a popular folk rhyme translated loosely to, "When the dog walks thrice around the bed, the soul walks once away." Of course, not everyone saw dogs as harbingers. Many people trusted their dogs more than their doctors. In times when human care was limited, a dog would curl up by your feet, share warmth, and lick your hand when you cried. They were both comfort and warning, depending on the hour. There were even attempts, believe it or not, to harness this ability. In certain towns, local dogs were watched closely by community elders. If a dog paced or howled strangely, it was interpreted as a call to prepare burial cloths or alert the priest. Superstition turned into semi-official surveillance. But not all were so lucky. In some cities, dogs were feared so much that they were rounded up and killed lest they call the plague upon others. A sad irony, considering how often those animals were simply responding to the grief and fear around them. Dogs are sensitive emotional creatures. Perhaps they weren't predicting death. They were responding to it long before anyone else could see it. One tale from the outskirts of Prague tells of a dog named Marek who refused to leave the church steps during a severe outbreak. He howled only once each night, and the next morning a villager would be gone. The people, both fearful and fascinated, began to leave offerings for Marek: bread, dried meat, small bundles of herbs. After the plague passed, no one saw the dog again. Some said he had been an angel. Others said he had taken the sickness with him. What's true and what isn't, historians still debate whether these stories were exaggerations born of grief, or if dogs really did show uncanny sensitivity to illness and death. We know now that dogs can detect cancer, low blood sugar, even seizures. Who's to say they couldn't sense the shifting chemical scent of someone slipping away? In times when humans were powerless, dogs gave people something to read, something to interpret. Their howls became prophecies, their presence a comfort, their absence a warning. And so, in the long, shadowy history of the plague, as bells tolled, and prayers rose and smoke curled from little clay pots of rosemary, there was also a dog standing quietly in the dark watching. Waiting, knowing. Cats and the witch panic. From rat catchers to witches' familiars. In the quiet corners of medieval homes before the plague arrived, in full force, cats were heroes. Silent, graceful, and efficient, they patrolled kitchens, barns, and grain stores, natural exterminators that kept the rats at bay. People whispered that a good mouser was worth more than a lazy servant. Some even believed that cats had a sixth sense capable of feeling when a storm or something worse was coming. But when the Black Death descended on Europe, something changed. Fear always needs a target, and when the sickness came faster than understanding could keep up, people turned on whatever they couldn't explain. Unfortunately for cats, they were just mysterious enough to become suspicious and just common enough to be everywhere. It started with superstition. Cats, especially black ones, had long been associated with witches in European folklore. They were thought to be familiar spiritual companions who helped witches cast spells or spy on enemies. A black cat crossing your path was considered bad luck. A cat that stared too long was said to be reading your soul. Add to this a rising tide of religious anxiety, and you have the perfect recipe for panic. By the mid-14th century, in some parts of Europe, cats were being hunted. Not just feared destroyed. Villages organized bonfires where cats were thrown into the flames. Entire populations of felines were wiped out in a desperate attempt to cleanse towns of sin, witchcraft, and demonic influences. There are chilling records from France and Germany that describe townsfolk gathering at dusk to burn cats in public squares. These were not isolated events. They were part of a larger, terrifying movement to purge communities of anything seen as unholy or unnatural. And because cats walked their own line, neither fully tame nor entirely wild, they fit the part. But here's the irony. By killing the cats, people unknowingly made the plague worse. With fewer cats, rat populations exploded. And with them came fleas, specifically Xenopsilla chaopes, the flea that carried Yersinia pestis, the plague bacterium. The very creatures that could have helped slow the spread were wiped out in the name of fear and faith. Historians still debate how much impact the cat purges had on the spread of the Black Death. Some argue the timeline doesn't quite match up. Others suggest the connection is strong. What's undeniable, however, is that the symbolic fall of the cat marks one of the strangest reversals in animal history, from respected ally to burned enemy, all within a single generation. There's a story from a Flemish village, recorded decades later, about a black cat named Merelda, who belonged to an elderly widow. Merelda was known to follow the woman everywhere, even to Sunday Mass. When the plague came, and the woman survived while many around her perished, people grew suspicious. They blamed Merelda. One night, a group of villagers stormed the widow's home and took the cat. The next morning, Merelda's body was found hanging from the bell tower. A week later, the widow fell ill. A week after that, she died. To modern ears, these tales feel cruel, unjust, and senseless. But they also reflect the deep, desperate attempts people made to understand something that defied logic. In the face of invisible death, tangible scapegoats became irresistible. And cats with their glowing eyes and quiet ways were convenient. Still, not every region turned on its cats. In parts of the Islamic world, for instance, cats were revered. They were associated with cleanliness and wisdom qualities that helped preserve their place in homes and mosques. Even in parts of southern Europe, some people quietly kept their cats indoors, protecting them from the mob and themselves from the rats. So tonight, as you lie back and listen, imagine those winding alleys of medieval towns, cobblestone streets, flickering lanterns, hushed prayers carried on the wind. And picture a single black cat slipping between shadows, not a witch's pet, not a villain, but a quiet keeper of balance. A creature that knew both fear and grace, a survivor. Perhaps, if we had listened to the cats, the story might have ended differently. Birds as air filters. Why canaries and pigeons were used indoors. In the flickering gloom of medieval homes and monasteries, where the smell of herbs mingled with damp stone, birds often flitted in cages beside the sick. Not for company, though their presence was oddly comforting, but for something stranger. They were quite literally the air filters of the Middle Ages. Yes, birds, especially small ones like canaries, sparrows, and pigeons, were believed to cleanse the air. Their fluttering hearts and delicate lungs were thought to be sensitive to miasma, the invisible bad air that was widely believed to carry plague and disease. And in a time before germ theory, when illness seemed to seep in from the air itself, having a bird nearby was like keeping a candle burning in a storm. It might not stop the wind, but it helped you feel less alone. The practice likely emerged from a blend of folk tradition and practical observation. People noticed that birds often died first. In cramped plague houses, it wasn't uncommon for a songbird to drop from its perch before the patient worsened. This made birds both early warning systems and sacrificial guardians. If they perished, perhaps they had soaked up some portion of the sickness. In wealthier homes, people kept doves or finches in cages above the bed. In monasteries, monks sometimes placed birds near windows or hung them in the corners of infirmaries. Some healers believed the gentle motion of wings stirred the air, preventing stagnation. Others simply felt that the songs of birds soothed the soul and perhaps, in a roundabout way, eased the body. There were even instructions in some folk remedies for placing a live bird near the mouth of the sick person, allowing it to breathe in the tainted air. If the bird survived, good; if not, well, better the bird than the child. In parts of Eastern Europe, a curious practice emerged: pigeon plasters. Healers would pluck the warm underfeathers of a pigeon, slice it gently, not fatally, and press it belly side down to the patient's feet or chest. The belief was that the bird's warmth and life force would draw the sickness out. Afterward, the pigeon was either released if it survived or buried with whispered prayers. To us, this may sound gruesome or absurd, but to a frightened parent or desperate monk, every heartbeat counted. And if a bird's tiny pulse could flutter a little longer in the name of hope, so be it. Strangely, centuries later, the concept would echo back in unexpected ways. Miners in the 19th and 20th centuries carried canaries into coal tunnels. When the birds stopped singing or fell, it meant the air was poisoned, time to leave. The science finally caught up to the symbolism. Historians still debate whether medieval people made this connection purely through observation or instinct. But what's clear is this: even in the darkest of times, the chirp of a bird, however brief, was a kind of promise. That life could sing, that the air might clear, that hope had wings, however fragile. So tonight, as you settle into stillness, imagine a quiet room lit by tallow candles, a little cage above the bed, and a bird rustling softly inside, its eyes half closed, its breath rising and falling. A tiny guardian, a feathered prayer, the toad under the tongue. An unusual cure and its logic. Let's pause and take a deep, slow breath. Now imagine someone gently placing a live toad beneath your tongue. Strange, yes. Disgusting, quite possibly. But in the era of plague and panicked medicine, this peculiar remedy was not only real, it was for a time remarkably common. In fact, some healers swore by it. The belief behind the toad cure rested on a medieval idea called sympathetic magic, the notion that things could influence each other through symbolic connection. Toads to medieval minds were mysterious creatures of the damp and dark. They were associated with poison, disease, and decay, but also with absorption. Just as a sponge draws in water, it was thought that a toad could draw in illness. So when the plague arrived, and the swellings known as buboes began to rise under the arms and along the neck, desperate people turned to desperate measures. One such measure, the toad poultice. Some versions of this method involved placing a dried toad or toad ash onto the swelling, hoping it would pull the poison out. But the most dramatic version, recorded in various English and French herbal manuscripts, involved placing a live toad against the bubo, or, in more extreme cases, into the mouth. The logic was this: if the toad sickened and died, it meant it had absorbed the plague. The patient might then live. In one especially vivid account from 15th century Wales, a young man was said to have survived the plague after his mother held a toad to a swollen armpit for 3 nights. Each morning the toad was found limp and pale, replaced by another. On the 4th day, the swellings shrank. The man survived. The toads, however, were not so lucky. Even stranger were the tales of toads placed beneath the tongue or inside the mouth, not for long, just a moment or two, before being pulled out and wrapped in cloth. Some accounts say the toads turned dark or burst, symbolic proof that the sickness had been drawn out. Other stories skip over the toad's fate, entirely focusing, instead, on whether the person lived. To us, this treatment sounds absurd and even cruel. And it likely did nothing medically, but in the context of a world with no antibiotics, no understanding of bacteria, and a lot of helpless dread, the toad was a kind of anchor. It gave people something to do. It provided a narrative. The toad takes the illness, the body recovers. A simple exchange, a hopeful one. What's fascinating is how widespread this idea became. Toads appear not just in healing records, but in medieval bestiaries and spiritual allegories. Some saw them as symbols of sin and impurity, making them the perfect vessels for disease. Others, more forgiving, saw them as lowly saints, suffering silently so that others might live. There were even craftsmen who made little toad-shaped amulets meant to be worn around the neck during outbreaks. Some were made of carved bone, others of clay or pewter. They weren't alive, of course, but symbolically, they did the job, a constant reminder that the sickness might yet be drawn away. Historians still debate whether this practice was localized folk magic or more widespread than we realize. Some scholars argue it may have had roots in earlier Roman or Egyptian healing rituals, where amphibians and reptiles were often used symbolically. Others think it's simply a product of medieval Europe's unmatched creativity when it came to finding uses for animals. Either way, the image remains a sick child, feverish and frightened a parent, pressing a soft-bodied toad against their skin with trembling hands. The candle flickers. The toad breathes slowly. Everyone waits. It may not have been science, but it was something close to love. Ferrets, weasels, and old folk beliefs. Creatures tucked in sleeves for protection. Let's wander into a quieter corner of medieval belief, a place where sleeves hid secrets and small slinky creatures were considered talismans of life. Imagine a ferret, soft and warm, curled up inside the wide sleeve of a woolen tunic. Its tiny paws tucked beneath its chin. It breathes steadily, perhaps twitching now and then in a dream. The person wearing that sleeve, man or woman, walks through a plague-stricken village, head bowed. Not a spellcaster, not a healer, just someone trying to survive, holding tight to an old tradition. Ferrets, weasels, and their kin have long danced on the edges of human folklore. Elusive, clever, and nearly impossible to catch, they were respected and sometimes feared in ancient cultures. But in the desperate logic of plague medicine, they became protectors walking wards against death. In rural Europe, particularly in parts of the British Isles, France, and Eastern Europe, it was believed that these animals had a special resistance to illness. Some said weasels were too quick to catch disease. Others believed they fed on sickness directly, like living purifiers. There were stories of ferrets stealing illness from children as they slept, taking it into their own bodies, then vanishing before dawn. So people began to carry them, literally. Sleeves in medieval fashion weren't tight or narrow. They were long, often pouch-like, perfect for holding herbs charms, or the occasional live weasel. Some nobles even had special fur sleeves designed to house their living companions, a practical feature perhaps, but also a statement: I am protected. This creature guards me. There's a recorded tale from a 14th century Welsh village of a woman named Eluned who carried a weasel she called Bran. According to local legend, she never fell ill during the plague, though many in her family did. When asked why, she'd simply lift her arm and let Bran poke his sleepy head from her sleeve. He takes what I would carry, she'd say. He listens in the night. Was it literal, symbolic, a comfort object? A superstition handed down from grandmother to granddaughter? Probably a bit of all three. Some people didn't carry the animals, but kept their skins close, believing that a weasel's fur, sewn into a coat, would ward off the pestilence wind. Others created tiny weasel-shaped talismans out of silver or wood, tucked them into medicine pouches, or tied them to the cribs of infants. Of course, there were skeptics. Some scholars and clerics scoffed at the idea, calling it animal idolatry. Others feared these creatures were familiars connected to witches or spirits, especially when seen darting in and out of plague houses. In one German town, a young man was arrested simply for having a stoat in his coat. The creature was executed, the boy was spared. Historians still debate whether these beliefs were born from ancient animism, misunderstood observation, or sheer desperation. But one thing is certain, people have always needed something to hold on to. Something living, something warm, something just mysterious enough to feel powerful. Ferrets and weasels with their curious eyes and silent company offered that. In a time when doctors wore beaked masks and prayers seemed to vanish in the wind, these little animals were quiet companions. Not loud like dogs, not aloof like cats, just there, tucked close to the heart. And in the end, perhaps that was their greatest gift. Because sometimes when the world is sick and the night is long, survival isn't just about medicine. It's about comfort, about ritual, about wrapping hope in fur and carrying it quietly at your side. Animal parts as medicine. Fat teeth tails and other ingredients. Let us walk now into the kitchen of a plague-time healer. The fire crackles low. Herbs hang drying from the beams, sage, rosemary, marjoram. But alongside them, a stranger assortment, a dried snake skin, a bundle of mouse tails, a goat's hoof, a jar of powdered antlers. This is not a witch's den. It is a medieval apothecary. And in a world where disease swept through like a scythe, every part of an animal, it seemed, had a potential purpose. Flesh, fat, teeth, claws, even things that once twitched or buzzed were collected, crushed, boiled, worn, or swallowed in the name of survival. Let's start with fat, particularly goose, pig, and bear. Rendered down, it was believed to soften buboes, ease chest pains, and act as a carrier for other medicines. Fat was thought to carry warmth, to restore the body's humors, and to draw out what didn't belong. A poultice of bear fat and garlic, for instance, was one popular remedy for fevers in Eastern Europe. Whether it worked, unclear, but it certainly left a mark, and a smell. Then there were teeth. Wolf's teeth especially were prized. Hung on cords around the neck, they were believed to strengthen the heart and protect the soul. In some regions, a healer might drop one into a cup of wine for a patient to drink, the idea being that the tooth had once belonged to a wild, strong thing. Perhaps its strength could pass to the sick. Tails came next, especially from rodents. Yes, mice and rats. In a delicious twist of medieval logic, people believed the tail of the rat, or its cousin the mouse, could act as a counteragent to the disease they often spread. Dried, powdered, and mixed with honey or vinegar, they were taken like medicine, a sort of fighting fire with fire philosophy. In one Polish recipe, the tail of a field mouse was boiled with onion and a single feather of a goose that had never seen the sky. Make of that what you will. Horns and antlers were also popular, especially when ground into powder. The resulting substance, often called hartshorn, was used as a base for various tonics. It symbolized resilience and regeneration, since stags were seen as noble creatures that shed and regrew their antlers each year. In a time when people were desperate to survive, the symbolism mattered nearly as much as the ingredients. More dramatic cures involved toads again, but this time dried and worn in little cloth sachets, or snakeskin, which was said to ward off infection when wrapped around the wrist. Some healers kept dried lizards or bat wings in their cabinets just in case. There were even records of powdered dog bones being mixed with milk for those too weak to stand. Of course, not all of these ingredients were easily gathered. A black rooster's feather or a fox's tail tip might cost dearly in a city racked by plague. And so, as always, people did what they could with what they had. For some, that meant slaughtering animals with ritual prayers. For others, it meant scavenging from those already dead. Still, a strange sort of faith clung to these materials. Not blind superstition, but a sincere attempt to interact with the world through what was close, tangible, and part of life. In a way, these animal parts acted as bridges between the human and the natural, the sick and the sacred. Historians still debate how widespread or effective these remedies were. Certainly some had antimicrobial properties. Bear fat and garlic, for instance, are both known for mild antibiotic effects. Others were likely placebos. Still others, like lead-based ointments or rotted meat poultices, were outright dangerous. But beyond science, there's the poetry of it, the idea that in the face of vast unknowable suffering, people looked to the earth, the beasts, the birds, and the bones, and said, "Help us." And sometimes help came, or at least comfort did, and in a plague-struck world, that might be enough. The rats, the real villains, when people finally noticed the flea's asterisk. There's something almost theatrical about the rat, shifty-eyed, sneaky, always darting into the shadows just before you can catch a proper glimpse. And for a long time during the plague years, rats got away with it. Not because they were clever, but because no one thought to blame them. At least not at first. In the 14th and 15th centuries, people blamed the plague on many things: foul-smelling air, planetary alignments, divine punishment, or bad blood. They wore sweet-smelling herbs, bled themselves with leeches, avoided strangers, and clutched talismans. But rats, those scrabbling little fuzzballs, were just part of the background noise of medieval life, like roosters' mud and bells. And so while the true culprits skittered under floorboards and through grain sacks, people looked elsewhere. It wasn't until much later centuries, in fact, that doctors and scientists discovered the real story, that the Black Death was caused by a bacterium asterisk, Yersinia pestis asterisk, carried by fleas, which lived quite happily aboard rats. Rats who, it turns out, loved living close to humans. They thrived in our homes, our barns, our ships. Wherever we went, they followed, tiny plague ships with fur and teeth. Some records suggest that observant people, did start noticing patterns. In certain towns, just before an outbreak, there would be a sudden and mysterious disappearance of rats. It wasn't that they ran away. It was that they died first. And that should have been a clue. Dead rats in the streets. Then, a week later, sick children, fevered monks, empty pews at Sunday Mass. But in a world without microscopes, the link between rat and death was too faint, too strange. Instead, they thought the bad air had grown stronger, or that the comet last season had finally released its poison. Rats remained innocent, or at least ignored. Until they weren't. By the time of the later outbreaks in the 17th century, suspicion was growing. People began to view vermin with more hostility. Cities started offering coins for every rat tail turned in. Entire campaigns were launched to cleanse cities of the filth that fed the plague. It was rudimentary pest control, and while often ineffective, it marked a turning point. Of course, it wasn't just about the rats. The fleas were the real villains. But fleas are small, invisible even to a frightened peasant with failing eyesight and a dying family. The flea's bite was painless, its leap silent, and so, like the shadowy hand behind a puppet, it stayed hidden. Historians now look back on the rat as one of the great unintended villains of history, not evil, just perfectly placed asterisk. In the wrong time with the wrong passengers. And yet, oddly, there were moments of affection for rats in plague lore. In certain tales, a rat might appear in a dream to warn of sickness. In others, a white rat was seen as a good omen, a guardian spirit of sorts. Some people kept them as pets, tiny companions in a world unraveling. One Parisian child was buried with his favorite rat curled beside him. Both wore scraps of red cloth, thought to ward off illness. It's strange, isn't it, that something so reviled could also be loved. But then again, fear and affection often live side by side, especially in times of uncertainty. And so the rats ran through the alleys of plague towns, unaware, uncaring, unstoppable. Not witches, not demons, just creatures doing what creatures do, eating, nesting, living. And unknowingly ending lives. Perhaps if we had noticed the fleas sooner, the rats might never have become villains at all. When saints rode bears, legendary beasts in healing tales. Let's wander for a moment beyond the realm of poultices and plague masks, into the wild, dreamlike world of medieval legend, where saints didn't just walk with God, they occasionally rode bears. Yes, bears. Massive, shaggy creatures lumbering through forests and across snowy fields, transformed in stories into holy companions, sometimes even assistants in healing. It may sound like fantasy, but in times of chaos and death, people turned not just to scripture and superstition, but to stories, and those stories were full of animals, especially extraordinary ones. Take Saint Seraphim of Sarov. Though technically from the post-medieval era in Russia, his legend echoes older traditions. It's said he befriended a bear who lived near his forest hermitage. The bear would sit calmly beside him while he prayed, and even waited patiently as Seraphim handed food to pilgrims. While Seraphim never wrote this bear, stories of their gentle bond made their way into Orthodox iconography, embedding the idea that wild beasts could become holy allies. Earlier tales are even bolder. Saint Gallus, an Irish monk who traveled to Switzerland in the 7th century, was said to have met a bear in the forest. The bear approached aggressively, but Gallus, calm and composed, offered it a piece of bread and ordered it to collect firewood. The bear obeyed. From that moment on, it became his helper. Some versions even claim Gallus rode the bear into villages, bringing news food or healing herbs to the sick. Whether he did or didn't, the story stuck. In the age of plague, these legends became more than entertainment. They were moral compasses. In a time when nature itself seemed to turn hostile sickness from the air rats in the walls, stories of saints harmonizing with animals gave people a sense of hope. That maybe, just maybe, the world could still be balanced. That holiness could be found in a bear's shadow or a fox's track. One lesser-known tale comes from the Alpine region, where a nun named Beatrix was said to be followed by a white bear during a local outbreak. Wherever she went, no one fell ill. The bear people claimed was an angel in disguise, guiding her steps and protecting her flock. After the plague passed, the bear was never seen again. Were these stories literal? Probably not. But were they true in the way that mattered to frightened, grieving people? Absolutely. Bears represented strength, endurance, and protection. To ride one or befriend one was to show spiritual mastery over the wild. And during epidemics, when the line between nature and death blurred, that mastery felt profoundly comforting. In some regions, wooden carvings of saints with animals, bears, stags, lions were placed at doorways or above beds. They were guardians' prayers in carved form. In remote mountain villages, people would hang bear claws over cradles or keep bear fur under pillows. A nod to the old legends, a whisper of strength. Historians still debate whether the riding saints were purely metaphorical. Perhaps the bear symbolized the soul's journey, the taming of sin, or the power of faith over instinct. But in the end, the symbolism didn't matter to those living through plague. What mattered was the image. A saint, a bear, moving together through the dark woods, bringing healing, bringing peace. And in that image, something deep and ancient stirred the idea that the world, no matter how sick, still had room for wonder. Animals in plague art. Symbolic beasts in paintings and manuscripts. Now picture this. You're inside a candlelit chapel. On the wall, a fresco unfurls like a dream or a nightmare. Skeletons waltz with bishops. Angels weep. A king lies motionless beneath a swarm of black-cloaked doctors. But look closer there beneath the altar. In the margins of the painting are animals. A dog sniffing a grave. A cat peering out from behind a shrouded figure. A rat frozen mid-scamper. A boar oddly gentle lying beside a saint. Plague art wasn't just about humans. In the age of death, artists painted the world as they saw it or feared it, and animals always close to human life slipped into these images with symbolic power. In illuminated manuscripts, animals were frequent guests. Marginalia, the strange, sometimes whimsical drawings scribbled in the margins, often featured rabbits wielding swords, snails fighting knights, and plague-struck animals limping or grieving, mirroring their human companions. Scholars believe these creatures represented emotional truths that text alone could not carry: fear, loyalty, madness, hope. One famous 15th century manuscript from Burgundy shows a dog lying on its master's grave, its eyes wide and mournful. Another from Italy depicts a line of cats watching a funeral procession. Were they curious witnesses, or a subtle nod to the lives lost because of superstition? Artists often embedded symbolism in their animal choices. Dogs were loyalty and forewarning. Pigs represented filth or healing depending on their placement. Rats, unsurprisingly, began to appear more frequently in later depictions, often as a visual shorthand for plague itself. One particularly eerie woodcut from Augsburg shows a rat perched on death's shoulder, like a wicked pet. But not all was grim. In some paintings, animals were shown resisting the plague. A fox standing guard beside a sick child. A white dove flying upward from a house where the curtains had just fallen closed. These images weren't just background, they were messages. Visual prayers. The silent hope that nature might still offer protection even when priests and physicians could not. There's a small painting tucked away in a monastery in southern France, anonymous, unsigned. It shows Saint Roch, the patron of plague victims, kneeling in pain outside a ruined city. Beside him is a dog holding bread gently in its mouth. According to legend, the dog brought food to the saint when no one else dared approach. That image became iconic, copied across Europe, carved into stone, embroidered into tapestries. Historians note how the presence of animals in art shifted with each wave of plague. During early outbreaks, they appear more mythic: lions, dragons, phoenixes, all echoing the chaos. But by the 17th century, the animals became smaller, closer, more familiar: cats, birds, mice, ferrets. The ones you'd find in any home, as if art was trying to remind people that they weren't alone, even as they died. And then there's the art that doesn't depict animals, but uses them as art. Rats nailed to doors, pigs painted with chalk symbols, dog skulls placed on altars. These weren't just superstitions, they were expressions, raw, immediate, and tragic. Folk art, born of fear. Modern historians still debate how literally these animal images were meant to be read. Some say they're just allegory. Others believe they reflect how deeply animals had been woven into plague psychology. But whatever the intent, one thing is certain. In a time when words failed and prayers fell silent, animals spoke through paint, ink, and blood. They stood watch in the margins of history. So as you drift tonight into your own quiet sleep, picture those gentle creatures, not as symbols of doom, but as witnesses. Quiet, loyal, enduring. They were there. On the walls, in the pages, watching with you. The chicken on the armpit. An actual medical instruction, feathered and baffling. If there's one image from plague medicine that truly makes modern readers pause, it's this. A live chicken tied to a person's armpit, on purpose. Not for warmth, not for companionship, but for healing. Yes, this was a real documented treatment, recommended by physicians, performed in cities and villages across medieval Europe. And no, the chicken didn't volunteer. Let's unpack this feathery mystery. The idea goes back to humoral theory, the dominant medical worldview of the Middle Ages inherited from Greek and Roman thinkers. According to this theory, the body was made up of 4 humors: blood phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Disease occurred when these humors were out of balance. Plague, with its fever, swelling, and blackening buboes, was considered a particularly nasty case of corrupted blood and poisoned bodily vapors. So how to draw those poisons out? Well, some clever and possibly desperate minds proposed that a live chicken, specifically a plucked one with its bare skin exposed, could do the job. They believed the raw skin of the bird could suck the plague toxins from the swollen lymph nodes, buboes, especially in the armpits and groin where the swellings were most pronounced. The procedure went something like this. Take a healthy chicken, pluck the feathers from its backside, usually the vent area. Strap the chicken bare skin inward against the patient's armpit or another swollen area. Wait. If the chicken looked ill or died, great. It meant it had absorbed the plague. Replace the chicken. Repeat as needed. Some instructions recommended rubbing the chicken in vinegar first or placing herbs on its skin to encourage drawing. Others advised rotating multiple chickens in shifts. A good bird One German healer wrote may serve 3 or 4 buboes before it succumbs. Now, did this work? Almost certainly not. There is no scientific evidence that chickens can absorb bacteria through osmosis, nor that tying poultry to lymph nodes reverses sepsis. But in an era without microscopes or penicillin, people clung to whatever gave them a sense of control. And there's something strangely poetic about it, a living creature giving of itself not through sacrifice, but through proximity. The chicken wasn't killed outright. It was invited to help, a fellow sufferer. Of course, many chickens did not survive the process. Some were weakened, others killed by stress or mishandling. And even if they didn't die, they were often seen as contaminated afterward and were quickly disposed of, either burned or buried. A sad fate for a bird that never asked to become a medical tool. There's even a record from a London household during the 1603 outbreak where a family used 8 chickens on a single child. The final bird survived and was kept as a pet named Mercy. She reportedly lived another 3 years and was treated like royalty. Modern historians look at this practice as a mix of medical misunderstanding and deep cultural symbolism. Chickens were familiar domestic creatures, easy to handle, associated with fertility, warmth, and food. In a sense, they represented life, and perhaps, by tying life to the body, people hoped it might chase death away. There's also the tactile logic of it, the warmth of a live bird, the softness of feathers, the pulse of another being. These things comfort. In the absence of understanding, comfort sometimes became cure. And who knows, maybe the chicken's body heat did help circulate blood or relax tissue. Maybe the placebo effect offered a tiny spark of hope. Or maybe, as with many plague-era remedies, it was simply something to do, a ritual, an act of care, however absurd. Historians still debate how widespread the practice was. Some believe it was mostly used by wealthier households who could afford live animals. Others argue it was a rural folk remedy adopted in cities out of sheer desperation. Either way, the chicken on the armpit remains one of the most vivid examples of plague medicine's surreal creativity. A symptom of a world trying to make sense of the senseless, a gesture of hope, a winged, bewildered little helper. So next time you see a chicken clucking calmly in the dirt, give it a nod. Somewhere in its ancestry, it may have saved a life, or at least tried. The sacred cow and the cough. Milk breath and bovine blessings. In the long shadows of the medieval countryside, where cows grazed slowly through misty meadows and bells tinkled softly around their necks, there lived a belief, both humble and holy, that cows, especially sacred or blessed ones, could protect people from the plague. At first glance, this may seem odd. Cows aren't fast or fierce. They don't fight or fly or howl warnings in the night. But they endure, they feed, they nourish. And in a world where illness could strike faster than a prayer, endurance was divine. In parts of rural France, Bohemia, and the Low Countries, cows were seen as protectors, especially those kept by monasteries or shrines. Their milk was believed to carry spiritual properties, especially when the cow was fed herbs blessed by priests or grazed on fields near sacred springs. During outbreaks, some families would go to great lengths to obtain milk from a holy cow, a beast said to have never been yoked, never whipped, or one born under a certain moon. The milk would then be consumed raw, often mixed with crushed basil or dried rose petals, and given to children or the very old. But milk wasn't the only thing thought to help. In some regions, particularly in parts of Austria and the Balkans, people believed that a cow's breath could heal lung illness, especially the terrible choking cough that came in the later stages of plague. Stories tell of sick individuals being laid beside a warm cow in the early morning so they might breathe in its exhalations. The idea was that cows, being large and gentle, had clean breath and powerful lungs. Their breath would push out the sickness or warm the chest or even frighten the evil spirits hiding inside. There's a tale from 15th century Moravia of a boy named Luca who was said to be near death. His mother, refusing to give up, led him barefoot into a barn at dawn and wrapped him in a blanket beside their oldest cow, Dorotka. The cow lay still, breathing deeply. Luca's coughing eased. Over several days, he began to recover. Dorotka was never milked again, and when she died, she was buried with flowers, like a member of the family. Some scholars argue that there may have been a small grain of truth to these practices. A warm animal body can help relieve cold symptoms. Cow barns, oddly enough, were often warmer and more insulated than stone homes. And there's no denying the psychological comfort of lying beside something large and calm in the grip of fever. Of course, not everyone agreed. In wealthier circles, such practices were mocked as peasant superstition. And among urban physicians, the idea of lying next to livestock was unclean at best and dangerous at worst. But even in cities, the sacred cow lingered in hearts and stories. Some households kept paintings or carvings of cows wearing wreaths of herbs, symbols of peace, purity, and protection. One 14th century German manuscript even describes a ritual of whispering prayers into a cow's ear before sunrise to seal the lungs from rot. Historians still debate whether this was rooted in older pagan beliefs, Christian reinterpretations, or a simple observation that cows rarely got sick during human outbreaks. But the cow, like the dog and the dove, became part of the great medieval menagerie of hope. And perhaps that's what matters most. Not whether the breath of a cow could cure plague, but that people in the darkest hour reached for warmth and gentleness rather than fear. So as you drift now, imagine that quiet barn, the straw rustling, the cow exhaling slowly, a hand resting on its warm side. Somewhere outside the world is spinning frightened, but here, in the circle of breath and peace, there is stillness. The donkey who carried the sick. Beasts of burden, kindness, and quiet resistance. Of all the animals that walked beside humanity through plague and panic, few did so as humbly or as patiently as the donkey. No feathers, no claws, no mythic powers or eerie premonitions, just hooves, steady steps, ears too big for its head, and eyes that always seem a little tired, a little wise. And yet, in the folklore and forgotten corners of plague history, the donkey appears again and again, not as a healer but as a gentle ferryman between sickness and safety. A beast of burden who bore the suffering of others, and in doing so, became something sacred. In the narrow alleys of plague-struck towns, donkeys were among the few animals allowed to move freely. They carried bundles of herbs, loads of laundry, and most often people too weak to walk. In some cities they were used to transport the sick to isolation huts or burial grounds. But unlike the grim wheelbarrows of folklore, the donkey was often guided by a family member, a friar, or a nurse, and that made all the difference. One especially moving tale comes from Siena, Italy, during the 1348 outbreak. A young girl named Benedetta fell ill, but refused to die in the city. Her mother, unable to carry her and unwilling to leave her behind, placed Benedetta on the family donkey Bruno and led him over hills and fields to a countryside shrine. Benedetta did not recover, but she smiled, they say, as Bruno carried her the wind in her hair and her mother's hand on the reins. Bruno lived 6 more years. He was never sold. When he died, the village children wept. Donkeys, unlike horses, were not prized for speed or nobility, but they were trusted, reliable, unafraid of crowds or corpses, and surprisingly sure-footed, even through rubble and ruin. In Spain, they were called Los Angeles mudos, the mute angels. In parts of Greece and southern France, old women whispered blessings to any donkey they passed, hoping its calm would follow them home. There were also superstitions in the Balkans. Touching the ears of a donkey was thought to prevent plague. In some German towns, a small braid made of donkey hair was tied around a child's wrist. In southern Italy, a donkey's breath, like the cow's, was believed to ease chest pain. But most of all, it was the donkey's role as companion that made it unforgettable. Not all carried the sick. Some simply stayed nearby. In one monastic journal from Belgium, a monk describes how his donkey, Elian, would stand beside the sick and press its forehead gently to theirs. He did not flinch, the monk wrote, not even when they coughed blood. Historians still debate whether the donkey's role in plague medicine was practical, symbolic, or both. It's possible their endurance made them the best carriers for rough roads and fragile patients. Or perhaps people simply needed something so humble, so good to remind them that kindness still walked the earth. So tonight, let's remember them. Not just Bruno or Elian or the countless nameless donkeys who served and died quietly, but all the small, soft-tired souls who bore the weight of our fear without complaint. When monkeys became doctors, exotic animals, and the illusion of wisdom. Let's now travel to the far corners of the medieval imagination where medicine meets spectacle and the healer sometimes swings from a tree. Yes, we're talking about monkeys, in robes, wearing tiny spectacles, and occasionally called doctor. This isn't just a joke or the setup for a riddle. In several corners of Plague-era Europe, monkeys, especially exotic ones brought by traders from Africa or Asia, became strange living props in the medical marketplace. And for a brief, bizarre moment in history, some were dressed as physicians. Let's explain. In the bustling trade cities of Italy, the Iberian Peninsula, and even the ports of the Low Countries, exotic animals were both marvels and mysteries. Merchants brought in parrots, lizards, peacocks, and monkeys. These animals were displayed at fairs' courtyards and occasionally in the houses of the wealthy. They symbolized status, wonder, and the edge of the known world. But during the waves of plague, some street healers and performers saw opportunity. Enter the monkey doctor. Dressed in miniature versions of the long-beaked plague costume, or sometimes monks' robes, these monkeys would be paraded through the streets on leashes, often holding scrolls, herbs, or even tiny jars. The handlers claimed the monkeys were trained in healing arts from the East, or Judea, or the lands beyond the sands. They told tales of monkey temples, where beasts cured men with jungle secrets. Crowds gathered. Coins clinked. The handlers then sold potions or charms, sometimes pretending to consult their monkey before offering the cure. He nods. Then yes, this salve will save your child. Some even claimed the monkeys could detect illness pointing or shrieking at infected individuals. In truth, the animals were likely reacting to scent or movement, or perhaps they were simply scared. It was theater, it was fraud, but it was also comfort. In a world where official doctors charged more than peasants could afford, and where their treatments, leeches, bleeding, burning, often failed, the idea of a monkey physician offered absurdity, distraction, and a weird kind of hope. Some households kept monkeys after such shows, believing them to be protectors. One Venetian diary from 1361 records a family who fed their monkey cloves, wine, and blessed bread every night, asking it to ward off the black wind. The monkey died of unknown causes 3 months later. The family was spared the plague. The connection was never questioned. Of course, not everyone found this funny. Church leaders condemned the practice as mockery both of man and God. Some considered it blasphemous, even heretical, especially when monkeys were dressed like monks or doctors. In a few cities, monkey doctors were banned outright and their handlers fined or imprisoned. But the legend stuck. Even centuries later, monkey doctor became a slang term in parts of Europe for someone peddling false cures. Woodcuts from the 1600s show monkeys wearing spectacles, peering into medicine jars, or examining patients' tongues. Satire perhaps, but also a wink at real events that once offered laughter in the shadow of death. Historians still debate the line between mockery and belief in these performances. Were the monkeys simply part of the joke, or did people truly think they could help? It's likely both. In times of despair, belief stretches, logic loosens, and sometimes the silliest answer feels like the safest one. So tonight, as you rest your head, imagine a cobblestone square at dusk. The plague bells have fallen silent. A man in patched robes steps forward, a small monkey on his shoulder. The monkey bows, adjusts its tiny mask, and hands you a bundle of lavender. Does it heal you? Maybe not. But for a moment, you smile. And that too is medicine. The dog who wouldn't leave. faithful companions at the end of the world. Imagine this, a cold dawn in a village gripped by plague. The hearth has gone out, the neighbors avoid the door, but on the stoop of a shuttered cottage lies a dog, still silent, alert, waiting. Inside there is no more life, but the dog doesn't know that. Or perhaps it does, and stays anyway. In the age of plague, dogs became both symbols and participants in the long, weary drama of death. They were not healers, not like the supposed plague-sniffing pigs or the protective doves, but they were there, at the threshold, in the room, beside the bed, sometimes long after everyone else had gone. There are stories from England, Italy, and Bohemia of dogs that refused to leave their owners, even after death. Some would howl for days. Others would lie beside the bodies, nuzzling them gently, as if urging them to wake. In some towns, people avoided such homes, not for fear of contagion, but because they believed these dogs could see death. To them, a dog howling at a door meant someone inside was already lost. One particularly heartbreaking account comes from the century Marseille. A physician writing in his journal described a large black dog found curled beside a plague victim's body. The man had been dead for 2 days. The dog was weak from hunger and covered in fleas, but had not left. When the burial men came, the dog growled and had to be gently coaxed away with scraps of meat. He followed the body to the grave and remained there until morning. Not all dogs were mourners. Some were messengers. In rural Poland and parts of Bavaria, there were tales of plague dogs animals who would go door to door, seemingly knowing where help was needed. They'd nudge hands, bark at unopened doors, or simply sit beside those too weak to call out. Whether trained or not, their loyalty became legend. And then there were the dream dogs. Some people claimed that dogs appeared to them in their sleep before a plague arrived, always the same, a white dog with red eyes, or a hound cloaked in mist. If you followed the dog in your dream, you'd survive. If you ran from it, you'd fall ill within the week. Naturally, these stories blurred the line between superstition and deep emotional truth. Dogs, with their unwavering loyalty, offered something rare during plague year's presence. In a time when even family members hesitated to care for the sick, a dog's refusal to leave became an act of quiet resistance. A statement, "You mattered. You are not alone." It wasn't always safe. Some towns ordered strays, killed fearing they carried the disease. But in others, dogs were kept near the sick, intentionally trusted, not to spread illness but to comfort. In monastic hospitals, dogs were sometimes allowed into the dying rooms, especially for children. The soft press of a muzzle, the thump of a tail, medicine of a different kind. One German chronicle even records a saint-like tale of a dog named Otto, who stayed with plague victims, licked their wounds, and never fell ill. People began to leave food for him. When he disappeared one winter, they carved a small statue of him at the edge of the village, tail curled, eyes watchful. Historians still debate whether these stories reflect literal events or the human need to mythologize love. Likely both, but no one questions the emotion behind them. So tonight, imagine that dog, sitting outside the cottage door, ears perked, waiting, not for food, not for command, just waiting for someone who is never coming back. But still, it waits, because love sometimes doesn't need a reason to stay. The Goat Who Ate the Herbs, Folk Medicine Mischief and Accidental Healing. Let us now climb a little hillside where thyme and wild mint cling to the stones and bells clink gently on the breeze. At the top stands a goat. She's chewing, loudly, and somewhere behind her a healer is sighing in frustration. This is the story of the goat who ate the herbs, a tale that appears in various forms across Central and Eastern Europe. It is part fable, part memory, and as always, with plague lore, just believable enough to make you wonder. The scene, a village struck by illness. A local herbalist, usually a midwife or an old man with one good eye, is preparing a powerful concoction of healing herbs. Feverfew, horehound garlic, angelica root, laid out in neat bundles on a low wooden table, blessed sorted ready. And then the goat arrives. Perhaps she belongs to the healer, or perhaps she's wandered over from a neighboring home. In every version of the story, she ignores shouting, waving arms, and thrown shoes. She walks straight up to the medicine and eats it, all of it. The villagers, furious, chase her off. The patient, too weak to be moved, is left without their cure. But here's the twist. In the days that follow, the goat seems oddly well, glowing even. Her coat shines, her bleats are cheerful, and the villagers watching her nibble the same weeds again from the hillside start to wonder what if she knows something we don't. And so begins a strange new practice following the goat. When she eats a plant, they harvest more of it. When she avoids one, they don't touch it. She becomes in a way their herbal oracle. The villagers survive the outbreak, not all, but many. And the goat. She is never milked again. She lives out her days like royalty, sleeping in hay lined with wild rose, and being hand-fed apple peelings. This tale, in its many forms, survives in Slovak, Hungarian, and Transylvanian folk memory. And while the specifics change, the theme remains. Sometimes nature knows best. Sometimes the wisdom we seek comes bleeding up the path when we least expect it. There's even a documented case in a 16th century Moravian village where a healer reportedly tested herbs on goats to determine their safety. The theory was that goats with their famously iron stomachs and curious tongues could help identify which plants were too strong or too gentle. One such experiment involved Angelica, now known to have mild antiviral properties. The goat survived. The herb was used. Modern herbalists smile at these stories. Some see them as charming nonsense. Others see the echo of real observational science, primitive yes, but driven by logic and deep attention to the natural world. Goats, after all, are excellent samplers, and their choices made over centuries of grazing might well reveal something about medicinal properties. Historians still debate whether these stories are rooted in true events or are clever fables meant to teach humility. But the message is clear. Even in the face of a monstrous disease, healing might come not from beaked doctors or gilded books, but from something small, four-legged, and very stubborn. So, tonight, if you hear a soft bleating in your dreams, don't be afraid. It may just be a goat, chewing her way through the world, finding medicine one mouthful at a time. Cats, witches, and clean homes. Feline luck, fear, and the plague they couldn't stop. There's something quietly magical about a cat. The way they move, soundless as smoke. The way they blink, slow, deliberate, like they know something you don't. In the medieval world, cats were both beloved and blamed. And, during the plague years, that duality became deadly. You see, cats once had a reputation for keeping households safe, not just from mice, but from evil. In rural homes, a cat on the windowsill was thought to block bad air. A cat that slept at the foot of your bed brought dreams without fever. In parts of Italy and Spain, people whispered blessings over black cats, not curses. They were protectors, quiet little guardians with twitching whiskers. But something shifted. By the 13th century, and especially during plague times, cats, particularly black ones, began to appear in darker tales. They were accused of walking with witches, of dancing with demons, of carrying the plague in their fur. Their eerie independence, their night wandering, their unwillingness to obey, it all made them suspect. In some towns, this fear turned into action. Mass killings of cats were ordered especially during early waves of plague. In England, France, and the German states, cats were rounded up and burned or drowned by the hundreds. The logic, such as it was, followed the Church's teachings that anything outside of obedience and control must be part of the devil's plan. But here's the irony: cats could have helped. Fewer cats meant more rats, and more rats meant more fleas, and more fleas meant more plague. Historians now believe that the persecution of cats may have worsened outbreaks in some regions. By removing one of nature's best pest controllers, people gave the real carriers of plague rats and their fleas free rein. Not everyone turned on cats, though. In certain regions, particularly parts of the Ottoman Empire, cats were treated with reverence. They roamed freely through markets, mosques, and homes. In Istanbul, feeding stray cats was considered a virtue, and during times of illness it was said that if a cat refused to sleep in your home, death would soon follow. In other places, families quietly kept their cats, hiding them from neighbors. One Flemish diary tells of a woman who baked bread for the town each morning and left a portion for her cat. When her street was hit by plague, she was the only one who survived. She credited the cat and never baked again. Cats also appear in plague art, tucked into corners or peering from behind furniture. In some manuscripts, they are shown curled beside the sick or cleaning themselves in the margins of texts about death. Cleanliness, after all, was one of their enduring virtues. To have a cat in your home was to suggest you cared for order, peace, and small rituals of self-care. Some folk healers even kept cats, not for superstition, but for comfort. A purring animal in a room of moans, a heartbeat beside your hand, medicine of a different kind. And then there were the stories, always stories of cats who stayed beside the dying, or who refused to leave a plague house, or who brought herbs in their mouths, though likely stolen from a windowsill. These tales blurred the line between truth and hope, between history and heart. Historians still debate whether cats were truly scapegoated out of fear, or whether their association with women independence and the nighttime simply made them too complicated for the church's liking. But whatever the reason, they walked through the age of plague both blamed and needed. So tonight, picture a small house. A sick child sleeps beneath a worn wool blanket. Outside, the world falls apart. But inside, a cat leaps silently onto the windowsill, tail curling. She watches, she waits, and maybe, just maybe, she purrs the sickness away. The birds that flew above the plague. Messengers of mercy, omens of loss. Look up. In every time of sorrow the sky remains. While the cities below writhed in plague, roofs crumbling and bells tolling, birds continued to fly. They dipped between towers, circled quiet fields, and nested in the eaves of homes that no longer held breath. Their wings, light and effortless, seemed to defy the heaviness of death. To the people below, birds meant many things: hope, warning, escape, sometimes all at once. In plague folklore, birds became powerful symbols, especially doves, crows, and swallows. Doves were seen as messengers of peace, often drawn in the margins of manuscripts or carved above doors to protect a home. Swallows, who disappeared in winter and returned in spring, were thought to carry away sickness like tiny winged priests ferrying souls to the heavens. But not all birds were welcomed. Crows, with their dark feathers and sharp cries, were feared. In some places, the sudden appearance of a crow on a rooftop meant someone inside would soon die. A crow tapping at the window was said to be death politely knocking. And in towns along the Danube, it was believed that if a raven circled a house 3 times, the plague would visit before the week was out. Still, people watched the birds. In Italy, some healers believed you could predict the course of an outbreak by observing bird patterns. If the birds flew low, sickness would linger. If they flew high, the air was clean. One 15th century doctor even recorded daily sparrow movements alongside patient records, as though medicine and migration could be measured side by side. There's a tender tale from the Netherlands of a young girl named Lotta who fed a single pigeon from her windowsill each day during the quarantine of 1636. The pigeon returned every morning. When her parents died and the house fell silent, neighbors said the bird continued to come. It waited on the ledge, peered through the window, and left only when the quarantine lifted. Pigeons, doves, even gulls, they carried messages between villages, often strapped with paper notes or tiny scrolls. Sometimes they brought news of survivors, sometimes the opposite. Birds also appear in plague art. In one famous woodcut, angels with wings of swan feathers fly above a burning town, casting feathers like blessings. In another, birds sit calmly on a skeleton's shoulders, life perched on death. In some cases, the birds were literal participants. Pigeons raised in bell towers lived among the dead for weeks, feeding off crumbs left in church lofts while the people below fell silent. And of course, there's the curious case of the plague doctor's mask with its long beaked nose. While not a bird itself, the mask resembled one. Historians still debate whether this design was meant to ward off bad smells, bad spirits, or to mimic the very birds that watched over the dying. Perhaps it was all three. In many places, when the plague finally passed, the first thing people noticed wasn't silence ending, but birdsong returning. A blackbird, a sparrow, a lark's high call at dawn. It was a sign the worst had flown away. So tonight, if you hear the soft chirp of a bird outside your window, or imagine wings sweeping silently through the night air, think of those long-ago watchers, the ones who flew above it all, who carried no plague, no pain, just presence, sky-bound witnesses to our darkest hours. The last beast at the end of the world, the deer that walked through the ashes. At the edge of every story, at the end of every village when the bells have stopped, and the fires have burned low, there is sometimes a deer, not fleeing, not startled, just walking. In plague folklore, particularly from Northern Europe and the Baltic regions, the image of a lone deer wandering into an abandoned village became a powerful symbol of ending and beginning. These were not hunted animals, not beasts of burden. They belonged to the forest, the other world. And when they entered the world of people, it meant something had changed. In Lithuania, there's a tale of a white stag seen in a town struck by plague. For weeks, death moved house to house. Then one dawn, when the smoke from funeral pyres was still curling into the sky, the stag appeared. It stepped softly down the main road, its hooves silent on stone. It paused in the marketplace, sniffed the air, and moved on. No one else died after that. Some believed the deer was a spirit of cleansing a forest god, come to reclaim the town. Others said it carried away the last traces of sickness on its breath. In Estonia, people believed that if a deer licked the doorstep of a plague house, the souls inside had been judged and set free. The deer, especially white deer, were thought to exist between worlds, neither beast nor ghost, and when they appeared, people paid attention. In some monasteries, deer were carved into stone gates as symbols of mercy. In remote alpine villages, offerings of bread and salt were left for the plague stag who might pass through unseen, but always noticed. One Swiss legend tells of a child who followed a deer into the mountains after losing her whole family to sickness. She was gone for days. When she returned, she carried herbs no one recognized and a strange calmness. She never spoke of what she saw, but the village survived the next outbreak. They said she had been led to the other side of death and returned. Even in official documents, sightings of deer are sometimes noted in the margins. In one 15th century parish record, the priest scrawled a final line beneath a list of the dead, and today a deer passed through the courtyard. We have lit no more candles. Historians often interpret these stories symbolically. The deer, with its silence and grace, represented the turning of the season, the return of life after death. Where the rat had been a harbinger of plague, the deer became its quiet, opposite a whisper of peace. There are also practical reasons deer appeared after outbreaks. With towns empty, nature returned. Grass grew between cobbles. Trees crept inward. And the deer, curious and unbothered, explored. Their presence reminded survivors that life beyond walls and illness still moved forward. But the meaning was always deeper. In the silence that follows catastrophe, people seek signs, and when the deer appeared alone, unhurried, it felt like a benediction. So tonight, as we close this long journey through beasts and buboes, plagues and paws, imagine that deer, standing on the edge of a ruined village, lifting its head, breathing in, and then walking on, not away from us, but towards something quieter, something alive. A soft goodbye from the age of beasts. And now, as the candle gutters low and your thoughts begin to float like dust in an old cathedral, let's gently step away from that strange, rattling world of plague and paw prints. We have walked through towns that whispered with fear, where the only sound was the echo of hooves on stone, or the quiet sniff of a dog at a shuttered door. We've seen chickens tied to armpits, goats chewing medicine meant for others, and monkeys pretending to cure the dying. We followed bears, birds, and donkeys through alleys of sorrow and out again into the fragile light of survival. And through it all, one truth kept blinking softly, like a firefly in the dusk. When the world became unbearable, people turned to animals. Not just for medicine, but for comfort, for symbols, for something warm and breathing that didn't ask for explanations. In their loyalty, their mystery, their simple presence, these creatures offered what no priest or physician could always give: a sense that we were not alone, that even in death, someone would stay, someone would watch, someone would wait. And perhaps that's what mattered most. So as you drift now, slowly, deeply, let yourself rest in the company of these beasts. Picture a cat on the windowsill, a dove flying quietly over the rooftops, a deer walking without fear through the fog. No rush, no noise, just breath and rhythm and a soft return to life. You are safe, you are still, and you are not alone.